Thank you. Before we start oral questions put by members to ministers, I will ask and remind all the honourable members that the use of Blackberries, laptops, and any other electronic devices is not permitted during question period, so they are to remain off during that time. Oral questions put by members to ministers. The time now is 3:37. We will end at 4:37. I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the NDP government agreed to give $590 million to 6 large corporations. Mr. Speaker, after receiving taxpayers' money, these 6 corporations laid off 1,310 Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, this is not a new trend. The government has signed deals with large corporations without any guarantees to protect the taxpayers in Nova Scotia. As the Premier watched large corporations lay off workers, he kept signing big deals with big business with no job guarantees. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians can no longer afford Dexter economics. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, when will the Premier stop signing big deals with big business which lack job guarantees?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, of course, all of the investments that we make are designed to ensure that there are jobs in this province. I know that the Leader of the Opposition opposed our investment in Irving shipyards, which will yield 10,000 jobs for the province. He opposed our investment in Port Hawkesbury paper, where more than 300 people are working today, Mr. Speaker, in that mill, and another 700 are working in the forestry sector as a result of that investment. Mr. Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition had his way, they would be shutting off the lights in rural Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, even Irving doesn't use the multiplier the Premier is using when it comes to what's happening on the shipyard, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll remind the Premier, Mr. Speaker, there are 300 families in the Strait area looking for work because he had no job guarantees when he was handing over $155 million. Mr. Speaker, I'll remind the Premier, Mr. Speaker, after $25 million spent in Queens County, all the workers got a pink slip, Mr. Speaker, and the list goes on. Mr. Speaker, this government cut $65 million from education, $100 million from universities, and more than $50 million from health care. While cutting these programs and raising taxes, this government gave $195 million to 6 corporations, proceeded to lay off 1,310 Nova Scotians. My question for the Premier, how can the Premier justify gutting education while writing big checks for big business?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, down in Queens County, we purchased some of the highest quality and most ecologically sensitive land in the province, Mr. Speaker, and I was surprised to hear the Leader of the Opposition say that if he were the Premier, not only would he not have purchased that land, that the purchase of land for the purpose of protecting the province's most sensitive ecosystems would not be a priority of the Liberal Party. It doesn't really come as a surprise to me, but it was interesting to hear him say it. Mr. Speaker, if it wasn't for this government, the investments that we've made to create those jobs, Mr. Speaker, thousands of more people would have been laid off. The fact of the matter is we have people working in the Strait today because of the investment we made.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
If it wasn't for this government, 1,310 other Nova Scotians would be working today, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government's track record is abysmal. Since taking office, the province has the worst economic performance in all of Canada. Not only is our current economic performance the worst in Canada, but by putting corporate welfare before the education of our children, Mr. Speaker, the Premier is eroding our long-term economic prospects. So my question to the Premier, why could the Premier find $590 million for 6 corporations to lay off 1,310 Nova Scotians, but couldn't find $65 million to ensure that our children get a quality education in Nova Scotia?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we are investing in good jobs for Nova Scotians. Just today, Mr. Speaker, the Halifax Chamber of Commerce published a review of the commitments that we made during the last election. There's an interesting table on page 3 in their review, both of the circumstances when we came into power and the circumstances today. So here are the facts, Mr. Speaker. Population up, labour force up, employment up, unemployment down, average weekly wage up, Mr. Speaker. I'll table that so the Leader of the Opposition can see it.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
There's another aspect of the province besides Halifax.
Order.
Just to say that all.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a recent audit of Nova Scotia Power shows that ratepayers may well have been overcharged by the power company by over $22 million. A finding in that audit that Nova Scotia Power tried to hide. And it was only because of the work of the PC caucus that information has now come to light, and Nova Scotians know that they were overcharged. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians want their money back. And so my question to the Premier is, will he take all the necessary steps to ensure that all of the money that's owed to Nova Scotians is returned to them?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the legislation is very clear. The Utility and Review Board reviews all the evidence before it. If there is an overcharge by Nova Scotia Power, that goes back to the ratepayers.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, here is some evidence that we can present right here in this House. Our power rates have gone up over 25% in the last 3 years, a real hardship for too many Nova Scotians, too many families, too many small businesses. Here is another fact. Here is another fact, Mr. Speaker. Here is another fact that is known in this House. Nova Scotia Power has already said if they owe the money, they want to keep it until 2015. Well, Nova Scotians cannot wait until 2015. That is why they look to their Premier and their government for relief. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians want their money back. Will the Premier make sure that Nova Scotians get their money back, not in 2015, but right now?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Conservative Party knows that when the Conservatives privatized Nova Scotia Power, they set up the system, in fact, which operates in the way it does today. I want the Leader of the Conservative Party to know that we are doing the best we can to clean up the mess you left behind, but it takes time.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, here is another fact that is known in this House. The Premier today is the Premier today, who is the one that is elected to represent Nova Scotians today. And they have been overcharged by over $20 million by Nova Scotia Power, and they want someone to get their money back for them now, and that person is their Premier. Will the Premier take steps to get that money back into the hands of Nova Scotians as he was elected to do now? Yes or no?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, today we are dealing with a privatized electrical utility created by the Conservatives. We are dealing with the fact that they chained us to the international fossil fuel markets. Coal went up by 75%, Mr. Speaker. That increased the cost of power. That is the mess that was left behind by the leftovers from the McDonald government, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we're working hard to fix it.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is for the Premier. And I'd like to thank him for continuing to adopt liberal energy policies and legislation. You know, on May 15th, 2012, the Premier had this to say about performance audits and spending audits of Nova Scotia Power. Quote, the Utility and Review Board said there are numerous audits that take place at Nova Scotia Power, that they have looked at them in detail, and that the cost of these audits do in fact get passed on to ratepayers, and it's an unwise thing to do, and I will table that. Mr. Speaker, does the Premier still agree with that quote that he said just a couple of months ago?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what I agree with is that Nova Scotia Power should be audited in an appropriate fashion to ensure that they are providing the appropriate service to the people of Nova Scotia. What I disagree with is the Liberal plan, which is to deregulate the energy market and cause the cost of electricity in this province to ratepayers to go up anywhere from 30 to 50%.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when the Premier has nothing better to do than to resort to things he knows are false, then you know that the Premier is grasping at straws and knows he's on his last legs. You know, I didn't know the Premier was angling so hard for a job on the Nova Scotia Power Board after he gets defeated. Mr. Speaker, it must be very humbling. It must be very humbling for the Premier to have to backtrack on his statements. You know, in May, the Premier said audits were not necessary, and today they introduced legislation bringing in almost word for word the legislation that we had. Mr. Speaker, in April he said that legislation was not needed in order for the URB to examine the Maritime Link proposal, and then he had to backtrack on that a week later. He was wrong, and he's been wrong again. So, Mr. Speaker, why does the Premier consistently misrepresent the Liberal energy plan, speak against our proposals such as removing executive bonuses, doing audits, only to then adopt these proposals later?
Order, please. Order, please. As I was listening to the question, I think that you were imputed motive there on that question. That's unparliamentary, so I'd ask the honourable member to retract that, please. Thank you. The honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're not misrepresenting anything. The fact of the matter is that member actually tabled in this House the Liberal plan for deregulation. He said they wanted to adopt what had happened in New Brunswick. They wanted to decouple the supply generation from transmission. That their plan and the leader of the opposition, along with that member, have said exactly the same thing that Mike Harris said in Ontario, exactly the same thing that Ralph Klein said in Alberta when they brought about deregulation. They tried to assure people that they would keep the board. And what happened, Mr. Speaker? What happened? Prices in those provinces went up by 30 to 50%. Mr. Speaker, if the Liberals have a plan for energy, they should produce it and stop hiding.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Premier is right that we tabled the bill, and I will table a quote from the Deputy Premier endorsing it on November 1st, 2006, the exact bill that we actually tabled in the House. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that the Premier has just demonstrated to every Nova Scotian he's never read a single word of any of the bills that the Liberal caucus has tabled, which outline that plan and are not deregulation, and the Deputy Premier has actually endorsed that plan, and I've tabled that. Mr. Speaker, the fact is, will the Premier now admit that he actually has never personally read any of the Liberal bills and simply relies on talking points rather than doing what a Premier should do and take the time to understand the issues?
Honourable the Premier.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, I understand the issues too well, and unfortunately this is a problem that the Liberal caucus have. They speak from inexperience, Mr. Speaker. We know what they're doing, Mr. Speaker. They want to haul people down the road of deregulation, Mr. Speaker. They have said, if you can imagine, that they are going to cancel all of the energy efficiency programs, Mr. Speaker. Saving Nova Scotians $100 million a year. That, Mr. Speaker, is a cut off your nose to spite your face, stick your head in the ground policy, which is exactly what we can expect from the Liberal Party.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on a new question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Premier knows that we have never once said we would cancel efficiency programs. The Premier knows that we have never once said that we would that we endorse deregulation. The Premier's own staff have said on Twitter that they actually agree we've never stated that we support deregulation. Mr. Speaker, why has this government spent 3 years defending Nova Scotia Power when power bills are such a drag on small businesses, the real engine of economic growth in this province?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we have cut the small business tax rate every year, 3 years in a row, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal plan that they have laid out so far, is that they're going to deregulate the retail utility. They are going to cancel energy efficiency programs. They intend, Mr. Speaker, to set the rate of return, to have that set by the Premier and the Cabinet, Mr. Speaker. Their intention is to set, if you can imagine, the maintenance budget they intend to set, Mr. Speaker. I wonder, Mr. Speaker, if they have any idea what they're talking about. It is clear that it's just the inexperience of that caucus.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the Premier will be willing to table the proof of all those things, since that isn't in any of the bills we put forward and never in any of the statements of any member of this caucus. So, Mr. Speaker, this government has spent 3 years defending Nova Scotia Power. The former Minister of the Finance, and I'll table this, defended the rate of return of Nova Scotia Power. At the same time, and I'll table this, that the consultant for the board called it obscene. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that there are businesses that are suffering in this province because of power rates, and those costs are passed on to consumers so that every single person in this province pays more for every good because power rates have gone up, and this Premier doesn't care. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that he wants to talk about the rate of return. We've never said that Cabinet should set it, but we have said Cabinet should look at it and examine it. So, Mr. Speaker, when will this Premier stand up and change the way the rate of return for Nova Scotia Power is calculated?
Honourable the Premier.
I can't believe, Mr. Speaker, he just said that. Look at it and examine it. But that's all. That's all. We're not going to do anything else, Mr. Speaker. So they intend to deregulate the market so they can take their hands off it. They intend to, they said that anything less than 7% would not be significant, so one assumes that means they're going to set the rate of return. They're going to cancel the energy efficiency program, and they have a leader, Mr. Speaker, in the last leadership debate said that taking the HST off of home electricity, and I'll quote, was bad public policy. So I can only assume that they intend to put that back on, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is the Liberal energy policy will increase the cost of power to the ratepayers of Nova Scotia.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I think Nova Scotians will believe the member over here who's actually tabling the Premier's own information rather than the rhetoric that the Premier can't even back up. So, Mr. Speaker, the Liberal caucus was on the record in the last session and the session before that saying we would not put the HST back on power bills, and the Premier's fully aware of that. Mr. Speaker, here's what the Premier did. The Premier changed the legislation for Nova Scotia Power during his term in office so that Nova Scotia Power now can earn more profit by owning independent power projects. Even the Tories didn't allow that. So, Mr. Speaker, why did the Premier feel that Nova Scotia Power should be allowed to earn more profit on the backs of ratepayers, something which has increased rates, something which he caused?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the member would understand that after the financial collapse of 2008, which, believe it or not, we had nothing to do with, there was no money to support independent power projects. If they wanted to get financing, they had to have some place to provide that. Nova Scotia Power did it in order to bring on more renewables. But you know, maybe it's just time that the Liberal Party set out what their actual plan is. Do they intend? Table it. Table it. What we're doing, our plan, our renewable electricity plan, is in the public. It is capable of being debated. It is tested by experts, Mr. Speaker. That's our plan. Let's see the Liberal plan and stop hiding.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's all very entertaining. I watched the Leader of the NDP and the Liberal Party arguing about whose power plan is worse. 940,000 Nova Scotians know the NDP plan has driven up their rates by 25%. The residents of every other province and state where the Liberals' ideas have been tried have seen their power rates go up by 30 to 50%. All we conclude over here, Mr. Speaker, when they criticize each other is that they are both right. So let's talk about something positive, Mr. Speaker. Let's talk about something positive. Yesterday, there was an announcement in Goldboro about a new LNG export terminal. Welcome news for that area of Nova Scotia and indeed for all Nova Scotia to see a development of that size. Mr. Speaker, over the years, Nova Scotians have become tired of watching their natural gas. They have been tired of watching natural gas piped from our province to other places where it's used to generate electricity and lower power rates. They are going to be equally concerned about watching gas now flowing in the other direction and then exported overseas. So we have an opportunity. We have a 100-year supply of natural gas that may well be flowing the other way into our province, Nova Scotia, so let's not let that opportunity go by. My question to the Premier, will he grasp this moment and allow Muskrat Falls to be compared to all of the other alternatives for generating cheap, clean electricity, including natural gas?
Here.
This will be a complete comparison. I would just say this, though. I think Nova Scotians have learned their lesson, or at least many of them have, obviously not the members of that caucus. But it was the policy of the Conservative Party that chained us to fossil fuels like coal in the past. And at the time, the reason why that was done was because coal was relatively cheap as a fuel source. The problem, of course, with fossil fuels is that they are variable, that they are volatile, so that the prices of them can swing wildly. In fact, just as the price of natural gas has done. So one of the worst things that you could possibly do is tie yourself to a fossil fuel that has that kind of volatility. Why? Because you have happened exactly what has happened in the last 3 years, Mr. Speaker. As the price of coal went up by 75%, thanks to the decisions made by the former governments, the price that went up to consumers. That's not because of anything this government did, Mr. Speaker. It's because of decisions made by past governments to chain themselves to the fossil fuel market.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we have heard the Premier talk about finding stable power rates. Nova Scotians now know that in his world, stable means going up by 25%. We have had the Liberals now admitting they don't actually provide power rate relief, only that they too want stable power rates, which in their world means going up by 30 to 50%. My question to the Premier is if he's so sure, he should prove it, Mr. Speaker. He should prove it because power rates are too expensive and a real hardship in Nova Scotia today. But he won't prove it because he has rigged the review of Muskrat Falls to exclude the possibility of comparing it to cheap, clean alternative sources like natural gas. And now we have an opportunity, because 100 years of gas is going to flow the other way through our own pipeline through our province. So if he really believes what he just said, why not expand the review of Muskrat Falls and allow it to be compared to natural gas?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Utility and Review Board will review the project in total. In fact, there have already been significant studies that have come out that have looked at a review of the project. They come to the conclusion that it will provide Nova Scotians with cheap relative to the other alternatives, cheaper power rates and stability over the long term. Mr. Speaker, I would think that that's what the leader of the Conservative Party would want. I don't, one of the approaches that we take, which I think is the right one, is to ensure that we have a portfolio of energy, so that there is wind, so that there is hydro, so that there is access to, there will inevitably continue to be some coal in that mix, and of course there will be natural gas, as there is today.
Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, now we're getting somewhere, because there should be a portfolio of energy-generating alternatives available to our province. Right. The Premier has already hitched his wagon to a gigantic mega project, Muskrat Falls, which is a 50-year decision that this province has to make in a very short period of time. And yet he's rigged the review of Muskrat Falls because he insists that they can only look at alternatives that are consistent with his renewable energy plan. Mr. Speaker, we all admit that natural gas is not renewable, although it is very clean, although there is a 100-year supply, and although it's going to flow right through our province. So if he is so sure that Muskrat Falls is better than natural gas, why not expand the review that the URB is going to undertake at the direction of his government, expand the review and allow them to look at natural gas as a cheaper, cleaner generation source for electricity?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I just don't think the leader of the Conservative Party understands the scope of the review. They have the right to look at any experts' reports they want. They can look at natural gas. I would just point out that Muskrat Falls supplies for us about 10% of the total portfolio that the province will have. It will have the option to be able to buy, in addition to that 10%, if it is at a cheaper price and lowers the rate for Nova Scotians, they will be able to buy the electricity that would otherwise flow through to other parts of the continent, Mr. Speaker. That puts Nova Scotia in the driver's seat when it comes to energy. It strengthens the transmission capacity. It means that we will be able to buy electricity from wherever we want without the transmission capacity associated with Muskrat Falls. We can't do that, but we will then be able to buy from Quebec Hydro, from New Brunswick, for that matter from New England, if it were available. We'll be able to take advantage of being part of an energy loop rather than being stuck at the end of the extension cord.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on September 20, my question is for the Premier. On September 22nd, 2012, the Premier had this to say about the deal he struck to save the mill in Port Hawkesbury. And I'll table it. He said, "I'm pleased to say we now have a new agreement that is a better deal for Nova Scotians." I'll table that. Mr. Speaker, part of that deal exempts the owners from the NDP's efficiency tax that is applied to every power bill in the province. So apparently that's a better deal for them. So, Mr. Speaker, why does the Premier think that Stern should be exempt from the NDP efficiency tax when other Nova Scotia residents and businesses have to pay for it?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand, and I know at some point in time there'll be an election, and the people in the Liberal caucus will have to go to the people of the Strait area in Antigonish, in Guysborough, in Inverness, in Richmond, and they'll have to explain why when they needed the help of the people of in the House of Assembly, it was the Liberal Party that stood against them. It was the Liberal Party that said you shouldn't be investing in jobs in the Strait area. Mr. Speaker, they'll have to explain why it is that they have decided to do that. We have invested in the jobs of over 1,000 people in the Strait area, Mr. Speaker, not because it was a political thing to do, simply because it was the right thing to do.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the fact that the Premier is incapable of even addressing the question ought to speak volumes to Nova Scotians. The fact is, he will not answer the question of why he believes a multi-million-dollar company that he's handed even more millions should be exempt from a tax that low-income Nova Scotians are forced to pay. You know, Mr. Speaker, so let me ask the question one more time, and maybe the Premier will explain it to Nova Scotians. Because if he honestly believes it's the right thing to do, then he should have an answer. Mr. Speaker, why does the Premier believe a multi-million-dollar company benefiting from millions of dollars of government handouts should be exempt from a tax on power bills that low-income families and all the other businesses in the province don't have the same exemption from?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I just think it's ironic that the member can sit there or stand there and ask about the about energy efficient programs that they have committed themselves to doing away with, Mr. Speaker. The simple fact of the matter is that low-income Nova Scotians are actually the ones who benefited the most, Mr. Speaker, as a result of energy efficiency programs in this province. More than $60 million will be saved by energy consumers over and above the $40 million that was spent, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, we have never once proposed eliminating efficiency programs. In fact, and I will table the statements of Mr. Speaker, I'll even table the comments of the Leader of the Official Opposition in the last session who said we would just change it so that Nova Scotia Power has to pay the bill for the independent programs. So, the fact, I mean, the Premier is just showing that he doesn't pay attention. So, I'm going to try one more time, Mr. Speaker, because the Premier has still not answered the question. Why does he think the Stern Group should be exempt from the tax when every other Nova Scotian in business is forced to pay for it?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell you this, Mr. Speaker, the energy efficiency programs that are promoted by Efficiency Nova Scotia were put together and recommended by an independent panel of citizens. They said there should be an independent arm's-length organization. We supported that, Mr. Speaker, and we support conservation and energy efficiency in this province. Mr. Speaker, but I can tell you one thing. The people in the Strait region, they needed assistance in order to ensure that there was going to be 1,000 jobs saved in that area. Mr. Speaker, they know one thing. If there's one person they would not want in charge in this province, Mr. Speaker, it would be somebody who would turn their back on those people.
The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, in its final report, the Electoral Boundaries Commission states on page 5 that they received a letter from you, Mr. Speaker, as Speaker, stating the following. The terms of reference established in the report of the Select Committee constitute the totality of direction to the Commission, and no person or body is authorized to give them further direction. That's page 5 of the Electoral Boundaries Report that was tabled in this House today. As we know, Mr. Speaker, the Attorney General on June 14, 2012, actually did give very firm, further direction to the Commission, setting them down the sorry road that we see today. So my question to the Attorney General is, in light of this revelation that no person or body is authorized to give further direction to the Commission, does he agree that the further direction he provided was inappropriate?
Honourable the Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure all Nova Scotians that this side of the House respects and values each of them, and that their vote is worth, whether you're in Argyll or whether you're in Sydney or whether you're in Yarmouth or whether you're in Glasgow, your vote is equal value. And when the electoral boundaries presented their report and were outside of the parameters that this House set, it was my responsibility to put forth.
Honourable member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. The Attorney General put his intervention and further direction in writing in a letter, and I'll table that letter. This is clearly contrary to the process outlined by you, sir, Mr. Speaker. Right. So to the Attorney General, did the Attorney General act out of anger or arrogance, or did the Premier or Cabinet authorize this inappropriate intervention?
Honourable the Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for asking that very specific question. My reply to that was on principle of morals and ethics, that each person in this province has value, that the vote stands there, and at no time was there malice or any anger. It was a matter of fairness across this province and ensuring that everyone's voice has equal value.
The honourable member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. We're getting into Banana Republic territory here. We have one party, the majority party, deliberately interfering with an independent process. Even worse, the independent commission, whose job it is to determine the boundaries for the next election. This is a shameful and sad day for a province that is home of parliamentary democracy in North America. We now know that shame rests solely on the shoulders of the Premier, the Attorney General, and members of his cabinet. Will he do the right thing today and apologize to all Nova Scotians, particularly Acadians, African Nova Scotians, and those in Yarmouth and Shelburne counties who have had their voting rights trampled on so crossly? And for interfering with this important independent commission. Because of that, will you apologize, and will you tender your resignation today because of it?
The Honourable the Attorney General.
I want to assure the member across there that the blood in my veins comes from the same historical period that his comes from. And I want to also point out that we have fairness and equity, that each person in this province...
Please. Order. Have a seat. Have a seat. The Attorney General has the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe in fairness and equity, and that one vote is one vote.
The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians are worried about whether they are going to have a job or not in this province. Last year alone, 8,600 full-time jobs disappeared from our province. Meanwhile, this government has handed over $500 million in commitments to big corporations. My question to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism: why does the Minister think big corporations are more deserving than Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, the member's trying to put words in my mouth. I don't ever recall saying that we prefer big business over small business. Matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, it's quite the contrary. We work with all businesses, small, medium-sized, and large business. You will find, Mr. Speaker, that if you did an analysis of the number of transactions that we've done since we've been in government, I bet you, Mr. Speaker, you will find that over 80% of the people that we deal with are small and medium-sized businesses, Mr. Speaker. We deal with our responsibility is to create jobs, Mr. Speaker. We are doing that, but we aren't discriminating against the size of your business. Mr. Speaker, you know, I could tell you a story, Mr. Speaker, about Bill Did It. A company in Sydney, Nova Scotia that employs 4 people when they started with us. Small business, today they employ 6.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think that it wouldn't be fair to say that 80% of the money spent by this government on economic development is spent on small business, because $600 million of it went to 6 corporations. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, this province has a terrible economic track record under this government. Nova Scotians are already being squeezed by this government's inaction on power rates and taxes, fee increases imposed by the NDP. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that last year alone, 8,600 fewer Nova Scotians had full-time work and now face insecurity that comes with part-time or multiple part-time jobs. So my question, why would the minister celebrate the fact that thousands more Nova Scotians are working part-time with little job security while full-time work is disappearing under his watch?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can stand in my place and I can proudly say that in June, when we took over as government, to the point now, as of September 2011, we've created jobs in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. We've created over 8,000 jobs in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a plan. It's called Jobs Here. I said 3 years ago when we first started with the Jobs Here plan, we've got a plan, Mr. Speaker. The plan is working. We are going to stick to it.
The honourable member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I can guarantee that no one is celebrating the job record of this government in this province. So, despite the messages and the brochures and the commercials, no one's happy about job creation in this province. So let's get the facts straight, Mr. Speaker. Since this government has taken office, Nova Scotia has less job security and full-time jobs are being replaced with part-time jobs at an alarming rate. However, 8,600 full-time jobs have disappeared from the province. This minister has seen fit to hand over $500 million to 6 corporations, Mr. Speaker. The result? Even more jobs lost, at a total of 1,310. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians lost 8,600 full-time jobs in last year. We have one of the worst performing economies in the country under this minister. So my question to the minister, when will he admit that his corporate welfare is simply hurting Nova Scotians while helping big business?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, under our watch, Mr. Speaker, employment is up, unemployment is down. That's the trend that we started, and that's the trend that we trust is going to continue. You talk about jobs, Mr. Speaker. Now, I listened to the member, and maybe the member should go down in Shelburne Shipyard and make that same speech, Mr. Speaker. Maybe the member should go to Cape Breton, to Port Oxford, to Newpage, and make that same speech, Mr. Speaker. Maybe that member should go down to A.E. Terrio in Metagan and make that same speech, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's working. We've got a plan. We're sticking to it.
The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. In light, I really didn't get an answer from the Minister of Justice, the Attorney General, on the process that we have all been subjected to in the electoral boundaries report, that Acadians have been ignored, the rights of Acadians, rights of large communities and geographical areas around Nova Scotia, and now the, of course, Minister of Fisheries, who was out on the floor of this legislature talking about the failed process. Seeing that all this has gone on, you know, Mr. Speaker, the constituency of Shelburne now has not been, you know, thoroughly talked to or been able to be consulted. I'm just wondering what the Premier's thoughts are on the issue of whether this boundary report is valid or not.
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Electoral Boundaries Committee, of course, submitted a report that was now consistent with its terms of reference. Mr. Speaker, I would just point out that you know, as the terms of reference for this was being decided, it was that member in that caucus that took the position that there should be a 25% variance, Mr. Speaker. They didn't, until the very last minute, even speak out at all about the consistency. Mr. Speaker, there were some eight drafts. There were some 8 drafts, and they never ever mentioned it once, Mr. Speaker. They, in fact, proposed that there should be a 25% variance, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I believe the way that the correspondence went, we suggested 20%. It was actually the member for Argyll that suggested that the variance should be 25%.
The honourable member for Argyll on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it's obvious that the Premier doesn't know the truth because the members, maybe his members of that committee didn't tell him the truth on that. I know I hear the Minister of Finance chirping over there talking about it as well. We know full well that when we were in that discussion, that we talked about the protection of those constituencies, the protection of Acadian rights in Nova Scotia, the linguistic rights of Nova Scotia. And that after that was taken care of, Leonard Scher, after that, I'm sorry,
Order, please. Order, please. Referring to a member by name is improper in this chamber at any time, so that includes every part of the debate. So I'd ask the honourable member to retract that, please.
I retract that.
Continue on with your question, the honourable member.
Thank you so much. And I know the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage was a part of our discussions, and I know that maybe he's tending to forget some of the parts of that discussion. Of course, the important part was the protection of Acadian linguistic rights across this province in making sure that those constituencies, the constituencies of Clare, Richmond and Argyll, were there to represent them in this House of Assembly. Mr. Speaker, only one party wrote them off, and that was the NDP. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is, in light of all this information, will he instruct his Minister of Justice to resign?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in just a second, I'm going to table this. This is actually I guess it's a letter that came from from the member for Argyll. It's called the PC position on the deviation of average number of electors per constituency. He says, in regards to the plus or minus 20%, we have to disagree with you on this point. It's our feeling that plus or minus 25% needs to stay in the 2012 terms of reference. He goes on to say that this is appropriate, notwithstanding the Carter decision, Mr. Speaker. That was the position of the Conservative Party that they tabled with the thing. So, Mr. Speaker, table it. Maybe it'll refresh his memory.
The honourable member for Argyll on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I can't imagine the crassness of this discussion. Mr. Speaker, taking that out of context is absolutely a disservice to Acadian linguistic minorities in this province. Had you been there for the discussion with the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage, the member for Halifax Citadel, he would have known that that was not what we actually meant. Mr. Speaker, there was also a discussion of cultural, linguistic minorities and the protection of their rights in this House of Assembly. So for the Premier to look for blame everywhere else, all he needs to do is look over to his right, look at the Minister of Justice, look behind him, and look at the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage. Will he ask for their resignations today?
Honourable the Premier.
Now that the member for Argyll has been caught in his own web of deceit, perhaps he should resign.
Order, order, order. What? Order. Out. On. Gone. I'd ask the honourable member for Argyll to stand up in his place, please, and retract those remarks and apologize.
Monsieur le Président, je vais remettre ces commentaires-là. Je dis en face des Acadiens de la Nouvelle-Écosse que ce processus est pas acceptable. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of all Acadians in this province, that we know that our rights have been taken away. And I apologize maybe for the remarks in this House, but for a Premier to say it like that is absolutely, like, I just can't believe it. I just can't.
Well, I don't think that that's much of an apology or in a sense of retracting your remarks, the honourable member. So I'm going to ask you to retract your remarks in this assembly.
Mr. Speaker, I apologize for the emotionalness of this. This has been very difficult for many of our constituents. I'm not going to. If he's going to continue to do that, I will ask the honourable member to retract, and if you're refusing and continue to refuse, I'll have no choice but to order you to withdraw from the House for the remainder of today, persistent to Rule 28. Again, I retract the remarks. Mr. Speaker, I am trying to retract them, but I'm hearing lots of other comments along here. I apologize to the Acadians. I apologize to the Premier. Maybe I was a little snippy on this one, but this has been a very, very, very emotional process.
Well, that was the third and final time I'm directing you to withdraw the remarks. Please.
I retract my comments.
Thank you. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you to is through you to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, the OECD has calculated that the rate of return on investments in public education to be 8.8% for girls and 13.6% for boys, and I can table that chart. This is an impressive and unheard of rate of return. Despite this information, the NDP government has slashed education funding in this province to the tune of $65 million over the last 2 years. So my question to the Minister of Education is this. Will the Minister tell members of this House what research she used when she supported the NDP government's decision to slash funding to public education?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We are investing in education in the province of Nova Scotia. We have had an issue of declining enrollment, and we are making sure that our investments are strategic and that our investments are going to guarantee that our children are going to be successful. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the question was what research was used. The World Bank's education strategy published in 2011 states, and I quote, "Investments in quality education lead to more rapid and sustainable economic growth and development," end of quote, and I will table that. Mr. Speaker, there is a body of evidence that supports investing in public education. This minister ignores that research. So would the minister please table the research that she used to support her government's decision to cut funding to education, something that is categorically opposed by economists around the world?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to remind the members of this House that this government did not take $65 million out of the education budget. I would like to also add that the per student
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The per-student funding per student in this province is higher than it has ever been. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask the minister to go back and do a little bit of math, because every board in this province and every parent and every member of the NSTU knows exactly what that adds up to. And over 2 years, it's $65 million. It's only two-digit adding, so it shouldn't be too difficult. Mr. Speaker, my final question. Knowing that slashing education funding cannot be supported by research, knowing that there are negative impacts from this government's cuts. They're being felt in schools, they're being felt in classrooms all over this province. Will the minister tell members of this House if she plans to continue her third year of cuts to public education?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much. I don't need to take a math lesson from the former Minister of Education. We know that our results in math are lagging. We are making strategic investments in this province for our students, and we just recently added 73 more teachers so that our children in primary to 3 all have classroom sizes under 25.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Monsieur le Président, je veux prendre cette occasion pour féliciter le nouveau ministre des Affaires acadiennes. Comme vous le savez, la communauté acadienne joue un rôle majeur dans l'identité de la Nouvelle-Écosse. Notre langue et culture est présente chaque jour dans des communautés à travers la province. Malheureusement, la communauté acadienne de la Nouvelle-Écosse se trouve attaquée par le gouvernement Dexter avec sa décision de silencer notre présence dans l'Assemblée législative. Est-ce que le nouveau ministre des Affaires acadiennes peut nous informer quelle est sa position sur la question des circonscriptions protégées pour les communautés acadiennes de Clare, Argyll et Richmond?
The Honourable Minister of Acadian Affairs.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux aussi dire félicitations au nouveau président de FAN. But as the member opposite recognizes and knows, that a question around the changes to electoral boundaries definitely should be answered through the appropriate minister. We respect the process. I respect the process. So I would ask the Minister of Justice to relay any questions. But it's unfortunate that the Minister of Justice is unable to understand the question from the honourable member. So maybe I'd ask he maybe ask the Minister of Justice in English, and maybe he could provide an answer.
The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Avec tout respect, Monsieur le Président, je ne pense pas que c'est nécessaire quand on pose une question au nom de la communauté acadienne au ministre des Affaires responsables pour le Bureau des Affaires acadiennes de ne pas répondre quelle est sa position sur la question des circonscriptions protégées, quand nous avons la communauté acadienne qui nous dit c'est partie de notre culture, c'est partie de notre identité, même plus important, c'est partie de notre futur. Et je peux vous assurer, Monsieur le Président, que je ne répéterai pas la question pour le ministre de la Justice, parce qu'en fin de journée, les Acadiens regardent le ministre responsable pour le Bureau des Affaires acadiennes. Et alors, je demande de nouveau, est-ce que le ministre des Affaires acadiennes peut nous dire quelle est sa position sur la question que la communauté acadienne a identifiée comme partie de leur culture, leur identité et leur futur? Ça, c'est la présence de les voix acadiens ici dans l'Assemblée législative.
The Honourable Minister of Acadian Affairs.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je peux dire une chose. L'Office des Affaires acadiennes travaille pour tous les résidents ici à Nouvelle-Écosse qui sont acadiens. Juste pas dans les communautés Argyll-Clare, mais aussi aux communautés Pomquet, Arichat, les communautés de Truro, la communauté de Halifax, où on avait la plus grande communauté acadienne ici à Nouvelle-Écosse. On travaille beaucoup avec tout le monde dans notre province, avec les services, dans l'Office des Affaires acadiennes, et je vais continuer de travailler avec tout le monde. Les résidents d'Argyll, les résidents de Clare, les résidents de Richmond, les résidents francophones et acadiens, tous dans notre province ici à Nouvelle-Écosse.
The Honourable Member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Monsieur le Président, cette question ici, ce n'est pas une question du futur du député d'Argyll ou du futur du député de Clare ou du futur de moi-même comme député de Richmond. Pendant le processus, les Acadiens à travers la province nous avons dit que les députés acadiens de Clare, Richmond et Argyll ne représentent pas juste leur communauté, mais ils représentent la totalité de la communauté acadienne à travers la Nouvelle-Écosse. Monsieur le Président, ce serait un rêve d'avoir un député de chaque communauté acadienne, mais ce n'est pas possible. Mais maintenant, l'Assemblée et le processus que nous avons suivi pendant les derniers 30 années nous a assuré les voix des Acadiens ici à l'Assemblée. Alors je demande une dernière fois, est-ce que le nouveau ministre des Affaires acadiennes, quelle est sa position sur la question de les voix acadiens assurées ici dans l'Assemblée législative?
The Honourable Minister of Acadian Affairs.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. C'est très important pour notre parti, l'NPD, le Parti de libéral, le Parti de Progressive Conservative, doit travailler beaucoup avec notre membre de travailler avec tout le monde qui est francophone, tout le monde qui est acadien ici à Nouvelle-Écosse. C'est notre job, c'est mon job pour les ministres des Affaires acadiens. Je parle et je travaille avec tout le monde ici à Nouvelle-Écosse qui est francophone, qui vient des communautés acadiennes. C'est important pour moi de continuer. J'allais, je pense, vendredi soir, la conférence pour fans. C'est important, on continue de travailler avec fans, avec d'autres associations ici à Nouvelle-Écosse. Donc, c'est mon job assis avec mes collègues de cabinet pour faire l'investissement pour toutes les communautés, tous les résidents ici à Nouvelle-Écosse, qui est français, qui est acadien. Merci, monsieur.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. The bill for the ads. Oh, wrong, sorry. The classroom cap has increased under
Order, please. Order. The time allotted for the time allotted for questions by members to minister has expired. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Speaker, I rise on a point of order. During question period, the Premier made comments in regards to the work of the Select Committee for selecting the Boundary Review Commission. In his comments, the Premier seemed to indicate that by supporting a 25% variance, somehow the PC party or anyone else was, in essence, working towards eliminating Acadian representation. Mr. Speaker, the Premier would know, in the first two previous independent commissions, the terms of reference had a clause that said, notwithstanding the 25% variance, that in cases of linguistic, cultural or geographic size, that the Commission may go beyond the 25%.